we just see this is a humorous anecdote, one which, when I'm rich and famous, we can just look back upon and laugh. This won't mean anything in 10, 15 years. No, they don't have that self-awareness. But we as educators do, and that also is part of our jobs. We need to hold that awareness for them in order to establish for them successes, ensure that they get that experience as well. Because early intervention is crucial. This expression you may be familiar with. Kindergarten to grade 3, we learn to read. Above and beyond that, we read to learn. So if those key markers are missed early in education, then absolutely they're always going to be clamoring from behind and struggling. Well, here we have a student who is in grade 4. So keep in mind, he's been struggling somewhat. And this child has his hand raised up. So I'm thinking it's not a student who has a learning disability. Because by grade 4, they have learned not to be risk takers. They put up their hand, they often get kind of some negative feedback. So no, they are not the arm pumpers in your class. As a matter of fact, you probably know that they have failed in public way too long, and nothing will shut a person down more than failing in public. They don't like surprises. They don't like pop quizzes, they don't like reading out loud, and they don't like being singled out. And mad minutes make them really mad. And the logical reason is because they cannot prove how smart they are in a timed or a spontaneous lesson. So this affects the way they think of themselves as a learner. And in this category of learning disability, there are many, many different diagnostic terms that can be very confusing. And I always tell people, don't get so bogged down in that. What as educators you want to look for is the red flags that show up in the student. Are they having difficulty with writing, with reading, certainly maybe the math piece, and maybe organizational piece, and of course there's that ever-present memory and organization piece. Those are the key red flags to a student struggling, and the possibility of you wanting to explore, do they have a learning disability? What is established, certainly in assessments, is that there is a gap. There is a gap between what they're actually achieving and their potential for achievement. Now, the gap represents itself in the following statistics. 35% of students identified with a learning disability drop out of school. 62% of students with a learning disability are unemployed after graduation. And 50% of adolescent suicides had previously been identified as having had a learning disability. We want to be a party to changing those statistics for the good. Stats Canada also gives us a statistic. I gave you some numbers from Ontario a little earlier, but Stat Canada records that of all the children with disabilities in this country, more than half, 59.8%, have a learning disability. The potential for youth at risk there is extremely high. We have to make sure that we are a party for change. Now, luckily for us, there are many researchers and many gurus understanding this identification who give us enlightenment about what is it like, what can we do about it. One of them is Dr. Martin Seligman, and he says that certainly very early in a student's life, repeated failures lead to feelings of shame, self-doubt, frustration. These are the students in front of your desk. Their heads down, not because they don't want to learn, it is because they absolutely are overwhelmed in the learning process. His book, and what this actually speaks to, is learned helplessness, that after a period of time, a student will step back and say, why bother? Everything, day after day, tells me I don't learn. It does not reinforce that I am smart. Even if someone says you have a learning disability, you're smart, it does not line up with their experience, and that's what they're going to relate to. Another expert, Dr. David Oren, says, imagine yourselves going to work and not being able to do your job, but you still had to show up every day. Well, in actual fact, that's what life is like for a student with a learning disability. That's his closing quote. He knows this to be true, as you probably do as well. The students do not have the luxury of choosing then not to go to school or to just change their job. I won't be a student, I'll be whatever. They must, day after day, trudge in and face the same mountain that they have to climb. But it really doesn't matter how many researchers I put in front of you. They all agree on one thing, that the brain learns by processing information. And we are doing it all the time. Information is coming in through our eyes and through our ears. But when you have a learning disability, often your brain is wired differently. If we can use just kind of that loose language, remember, it's not defective. It simply is not going to be the same as your mainstream learner. So I can't really explain the mechanics of a brain. I'm going to borrow a metaphor from another educator, a Mr. Todd Cunningham, who is a prof at Trent University. He has a learning disability, and he reads and writes at a grade 6 level. He does all of his communication with assistive technology. And he challenges us to think of our brains as being like a filing cabinet, that the same steps that are involved in filing information are exactly the same steps as we do when we are learning something. So even today, you are, step 1, receiving information, and you're taking that information and you're organizing it and storing it in an area of your brain. Probably some of it's going in the logical left side of your brain, and some of the information is going in a file around the abstract thinking. The next step, it sits there until you need to retrieve the information, another step in filing information. And when you retrieve it, no doubt you want to communicate, the final step in filing and in learning. Well, for a student with a learning disability who processes differently, some or maybe all of these steps can be challenged.